Hello everyone, Lewis here. Going to read to you, as promised, a short story from a friend of the show. Might know them as Gigi's Befouled van. The van is it, isn't it? Anyway, the short story is called Fontaine's Urn. I was gonna just clip the reading I did from the stream yesterday, but I decided to put the text into Microsoft Word, gussy it up a bit, put some mood music in the background, and here we are. So without further ado, Fontaine's Urn. George Alexander Yared nervously drummed his fingers across the top of the greasy steering wheel in front of him. It was close to dusk, and tired rays of dying sunlight bathed the street he was idling on in a sick shade of orange. He shifted uncomfortably, the driver's seat giving a pained groan on its blown-out support structure. This place felt wrong, and George knew he wasn't typically one to see a commitment through to the end, but something compelled him not to put the van into drive and get the hell out of there. There was no movement anywhere, no other vehicles, and only dark rectangles of empty windows stretched into the distance. His phone was off, mostly to avoid the trolls for the evening, but also because he knew he needed to focus his thoughts. He sighed deeply and recalled the instructions in the email from earlier in the day. It said to knock on the door of the address listed at exactly 8 p.m. It said to ask for Brenda. It said to bring $300 in cash. It said to bring 4 fresh eels. It said to bring the urn. It said some other things, but George grew distracted as he looked at the dull, scuffed urn on its side in the passenger seat. George had to dig through the mountain of rotting clothing and debris that formed layers in the back of the van that had eventually found Fontaine's urn. He remembered feeling sick when he laid eyes on it for the first time in years, peeling a sticky old burger wrapper from its gummy, scuffed surface. Strings of congealed grease had refused to snap at first, drawing out into thin lines like pulling away a fresh slice of pizza. Despite himself, his mouth watered at the thought of a greasy burger. The eels made the car smell like old seafood, but mostly just mixed in with the ever-present odor of old fast food and caked-on body odor. The instructions had been clear, and the penalties for failing to arrive with the correct reagents would be severe. George averted his gaze from the urn and looked down the deserted street as the last of the sunlight finally faded away. One street light, a block or so away, guttered into life. George shivered despite the cloying, musty atmosphere within the van. It was showtime. He collected the urn, hefted a white plastic grocery bag that held the eels and several other items, and exited the van. It rocked hard on its springs as its bulk eased off the suspension, the joints of the van protesting weakly with pained squeaks. The van didn't have much strength left these days, but George knew that if things went as planned tonight, that wouldn't matter much anymore. It wouldn't matter that the van wouldn't start anymore one day. It wouldn't matter that his show was a joke. It wouldn't matter that he had no friends or family. It wouldn't matter that Jamie was dead. None of it would matter anymore. Feeling a spark of fresh resolve, George waddled towards one of the darkened, dilapidated houses. The singular streetlight, a block away, cast just enough light to see. The front lawn was small, but overgrown in stunted, brackish weeds and brush. It looked like if you strayed off the cracked concrete walkway that you get stuck with stickers or dry needle-like shrubbery. The house front was flaking with white paint, with one plain-looking single door flanked by 2 dead rectangular windows. George made out the remains of a car frame engulfed in the shrubbery, clearly laying there for potentially decades. He approached the door, recalling the instructions to knock exactly 3 times, and thumped the swollen meat of his hand against the door. The door almost immediately opened, making George take a startled half step backward. Framed in the darkness, with flickering candlelight visible deeper inside the darkened house, stood Brenda Bradshaw, George's psychic. She was an old woman, frail looking, with thin white hair. She wore a tattered nightgown, loose looking slippers, and held one of her hands behind her back. George could barely make her face out in the darkness, her silhouette dancing in the weak candle flame behind her. Her eye sockets were like black craters lined with spider webs, shifting as she regarded him. "Hello, George," she said, turning away from him, depositing something heavy on the stand just inside the doorway. George took the greeting as an invitation to come inside and saw the outline of a handgun resting on the side table. "Jesus, Brenda, you know I don't like guns. Were you planning on shooting me?" Brenda didn't respond right away, and instead slowly shuffled to a stop and looked back behind her down the hallway she was walking down. Her voice should have echoed, but instead came through to George as if they were under a heavy blanket. "I didn't need to. You followed the directions. Well, come on then. Let's get you situated." George ignored the persistent warning sirens going off in his fatigued brain and set off after Brenda deeper into the house, closing the door behind them. It got noticeably darker without the gloom from the streetlight outside, and George immediately missed being anywhere besides inside this house right now. The smell inside was bizarre, a cross between fresh sawdust and a huge spice collection left to mold over in a dark closet under a drip of water. He clutched the urn tighter, finding a small amount of solace in doing so. Brenda had been George's psychic for hire for nearly 30 years, and he had paid her thousands of dollars since then for various readings and assistance with certain rituals and rites. For a while, it had been lighthearted fun, just a frivolous pastime for George. Over time, though, especially as Brenda grew advanced in years, things began to change. Her demeanor had grown sunken and ashen, her readings more strange, almost erratic. She would often fail to respond to George's requests for readings lately, saying she was busy dedicating herself to learning new things, whatever that meant. It was clear that Brenda had about as much time left as the fan did. That was okay with George. He only needed her skills one last time. George followed Brenda around the corner at the end of the hallway and entered into the kitchen. The source of the candlelight was finally revealed, with several waxen stubs scattered around, fluttering lightly as their entrance disturbed the flat air. Brenda walked around to the other side of a narrow wooden table, gesturing at a linoleum chair that looked straight out of the 50s. George sat down in the chair as Brenda sat down across from him. It was extraordinarily uncomfortable. Brenda stared at George from across the empty table. The pupils of her eyes were visible, glittering in the candlelight, regarding George silently. George shifted on the chair nervously. It was almost dead silent in the room. The table had a large diagram of some sort scratched into it, but it was hard to make out exactly what the shapes and intersections were. George cleared his throat and moved to place the urn on the table. Brenda's hand shot up in a halting gesture, the fastest she'd moved so far. George flinched involuntarily. "Cash first," she said. George nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off of Brenda's, and fished a squashed fold of bills out of a torn jeans pocket. He placed it in the center of the table. $300, it's all there. I have the other stuff too. The eels, the urn. George tapered off, realizing Brenda wasn't paying attention. She took the bills without counting them and dropped them into a pouch on her nightgown. Then she fished around in the same pocket for a moment and came back with a filthy-looking knife. It had dark patches of what looked like fuzzy rust growing across its large pitted blade. It glinted roughly in the candlelight as she placed it softly onto the table. Brenda nodded, satisfied, and started speaking again. Place the eels, one in each corner of the room. You know the drill. You've done this before. George stood up and fished a package of eels out of the grocery store bag. Peeling the plastic cover of the container bag, he walked to each corner of the small room and left a wet eel segment in each one. He could feel Brenda's eyes on him the entire time, and his thoughts kept jumping to the large knife. That part was new. He'd used eels before in other rituals with Brenda's guidance, but never like this. This time was different. The stakes were higher, he thought to himself, eyeing the dull silver urn under his chair. You understand what will happen here tonight, right, George? To George, Brenda's voice sounded like what decade-old cigarette smoke would smell like. He grimaced and placed the final eel in the last uneeled corner of the room. Brenda looked. Oh, this is way beyond anything we've ever done before. I've paid you for tarot readings, some basic spells, never anything like this. I shouldn't even be here. It's too fucking much. I had to DoorDash for a week to even afford it. $300 is cheap, George. Spiritual resurrections aren't easy. They can go wrong, George. Do you understand that? It might just be a dog spirit, but it's still nothing anyone should play games with. The dog spirit. Right, George thought, waddling back to his chair at the table. Fontaine's ashes were in that urn. Fontaine, George's old, long-departed dog, represented a dead era in George's woeful past. When Brenda had offered to let him talk to Fontaine's spirit one last time, to say his final goodbyes and recompenses, his mind went to dark places. One dark place in particular had driven him to this moment, to this shot in the dark for one last chance at something like redemption. I've told you a dozen times that I understand, Brenda. Can we please just get this over with? I still got a dash tonight. I burned a quarter tank of gas just driving out here. Brenda dryly clicked her tongue and shook her head slightly. The candle scuttered nearby and stayed lit. Very well. Place the remaining items on the table. George reverently placed the heavy urn in the center of the scratched-in carvings on the table, followed by several other objects in seemingly random places surrounding it. The filthy remains of a Halloween mask depicting an old man, a single gumball, an empty, battered can of Lysol. George owned little of what one would consider valuable, but the ritual demanded items of importance to George's past, and these were the best he had to work with, fished out of the trash in back of the van. The items placed, he sat back in his chair. Without speaking, Brenda slowly stood from the chair, pushing it back from the table with a hollow scraping sound. She was a short woman that seemed to tower over George right then. Her hands slowly rose by her sides, and she leaned her head back to face the ceiling, almost imploring a lightning strike or some kind of smite from above. George nervously clasped his hands in his lap, watching this unfold, eyes darting from Brenda to Fontaine's urn repeatedly. Brenda began to speak in something like tongues. It was quiet at first, but started to slowly grow in intensity. The candlelight almost seemed to dim, but they were so close to going out that it could have just been a trick of the eye. George felt a small vibration forming along the floor, which slowly traveled up the table to make the items almost buzz in place. George began to get scared, but was frozen, wide-eyed. Brenda was nearly shouting now, imploring dark energies, directing them into the diagram scratched onto the table, willing the spirit to return to the remains held within the urn. She arched her back, bones cracking arthritically, and in one violent motion, clutched down for the rusty knife, whipped it up, and slashed it across the length of her left arm. George reeled back as blood sprayed out across the table, dousing the diagram, the items, and the urn itself. It looked horrifically painful, if not fatal given the amount of blood, but Brenda seemed unfazed. The candlelight winked out and plunged the room into darkness. George was terrified now, his fist balled tight in a fight-or-flight animal response. After a long few seconds, a low violet glow began to suffuse the room, and George looked around bewildered. There was no obvious source, but it continued to grow brighter, thicker even. The low thrumming buzz was also now audible, and the vibrations that had suffused the room all came to a crescendo before abruptly stopping once. "The spirit approaches," hissed Brenda, still standing, blood soaking down into the front of her nightgown, arms aloft in something mimicking worship. Her eyes were rolled into the back of her head now. The violet light grew more intense, and George noticed it was getting harder to breathe. The light started to circle and coalesce, like a slow-moving vortex swirling down onto the urn itself. It grew into an almost solid violet orb around the urn, rotating and vibrating with energy. And then it paused, and George could tell that the secret within the urn was about to come to fruition. Brenda knew something was wrong almost immediately. "What did you do?" she yelled, dropping the knife noisily onto the table, taking a staggered step backwards. The colored orb flashed dark maroon, then crackled with angry-looking energy. "What did you do?" she shouted, horrified. George stood up too, knocking his chair over. The room was full of an angry hum buzz now, a gusty wind picking up debris and knocking objects around. Brenda clawed towards the urn, inserting her hand into the orb of energy to grasp the lid, missing in pain. George was horrified to see the hand immediately turning a shade of purple and then black, atrophying rapidly. Brent howled in pain, but still managed to wrench the lid of the urn open. It fell from her hands, a pile of smoldering ashes spilling out, along with a pair of soiled women's panties. George sobbed in fear at the sight of Jamie's panties, the same pair he'd kept from her after all these years since her death. The panties being revealed seemed to galvanize the spirit in the room into a fit of rage. The garment suddenly burst into bright green flames. "It's Jamie's spirit, George. She came here because of your trick, and now we're both damned," Brenda shrieked. George wailed at Brenda. "I had to see her. I had to say goodbye, to say I'm sorry. We shared a bed. We shared a bed." Having had enough, Brenda bolted for the door, but was held fast by an invisible force. She was twisted around painfully to face George, her face a silent rictus of pain and terror, before her body was wrenched around an entire 360-degree corkscrew. A lone spray of blood arced out from somewhere amidst the twisted folds of meat, and Brenda's two halves flopped wetly together into a heap on the floor. George collapsed onto his large ass, and his bowels let loose involuntarily. The mass of violet energy approached George, crackling and coalescing into something more solid-looking. It presently loomed above George on the floor, and finally assumed a hazy, somewhat human-looking form. It had Jamie's face, and a ghostly Fontaine phased in and out of existence at the feet of the entity. The face was stitched with fury, and Fontaine's teeth were bared. The hack was raised. The hatred they both held for George sent arcs of electrical energy spearing into the walls, floor, and ceiling. "We shared the bed," he stammered, tears running down his face. George felt his clothes catch fire, and he let out an inhuman scream of pain and fear before everything vanished in a sudden white flare of heat. The local Richmond News will report the sudden violent explosion of the house in a quiet out-of-the-way suburb as a gas leak accident. 2 fatalities, one retired old woman and a local homeless man with no relatives or friends. No human remains were found, but a pair of dirty craft wranglers from a nearby van and uncovered text messages helped identify the people present at the time of the explosion. A Will Markland provided some additional context on the situation via police hotline. George was always chasing the next big thing, trying to catch up to those he knew were superior to him, as it were. He never wanted help from anyone, and always pushed people away, so it's no wonder he couldn't even afford a pauper's grave in the end. We can only hope that everyone he's hurt in his life, especially Jamie Whalen, achieves justice and peace from the likes of George Alexander.